1 year ago, I had moved out of the inner city to a small suburban home just outside of city limits. I was tired of the hustling and bustling of the overpopulated hellhole and wanted to experience the quaint lifestyle outside of the city. All of my neighbors were so welcoming. There was David, who lived across the street, with his 2 kids, Nathan and little Emily. George, my next-door neighbor, was an elderly man who had a gorgeous Corvette he was in the process of restoring. At the end of the street was Nancy. Nancy was sort of a recluse. She didn't interact with me much since I had moved in. Nancy's land consumed the remainder of the neighborhood. She had 4 horses and 2 dogs. I never thought much of Nancy other than the fact that she must have loved her animals and wasn't much of a people person. That was soon to change. I really enjoyed living there in my single-story Rambler-style home. At night, you could actually hear the crickets chirping and wolves howling off in the distance. It really gave you an odd sense of security knowing that there wasn't some drug addict prowling the streets looking for an unsuspecting victim. Up until a certain point, things were going great. Everyone smiled at each other as they passed by. If I needed to borrow David's leaf blower or George's air compressor, they'd gladly allow it. It was just all around pleasant. The perfect neighborhood. About a few days after settling in, I'd occasionally spot Nancy walking her dogs around the neighborhood. I was determined to get to know her better. I knew that if I could manage to squeeze even a 15-minute conversation from her, I'd feel so much better about the whole thing. I think I just really wanted her to like me, I guess. One morning I was headed out to work when I spotted her. She was walking down the sidewalk with both of her little dogs on a leash, wearing a pink bathrobe and matching slippers. I quickly started up my car and was then in pursuit. I pulled up alongside Nancy and rolled down my window. "Good morning, neighbor," I said to her as pleasantly as I possibly could with a big, stupid grin spread across my face. Nancy then stopped dead in her tracks. It was very off-putting. I waited for a moment, expecting some sort of response. Nancy just hypnotically stared ahead, as if I wasn't even there. It was the creepiest thing. These attempts went on for a while, and each time I'd get the same response. When I had decided to stop, things got even weirder. Nancy stopped walking her dogs in the morning. She broke her routine. Her house was only a couple 100 feet from mine. If I stood in my driveway, I could barely see her porch. One morning, I was warming up my car, coffee in hand, when I remembered I had forgotten something inside. I hastily made my way into the house, only to come back to find Nancy standing there, on her porch, in her same fuzzy matching robe and slippers. It looked as if she were staring directly at me, but it was hard to tell since she was barely visible. It gave me chills. A day or so later, David had me over for a couple of beers. I was hesitant at first to bring it up, but a few bottles of liquid confidence and a burning curiosity managed to take control. "So, tell me about Nancy." David immediately stopped playing with his out-of-tune guitar and froze. He looked up at me with an odd look, something like a mixture of fear and worry. "What about Nancy?" David replied. The tone in his voice seemed peculiar. It was the tone of a young boy who had been confronted about a broken vase he once thought he had well hidden. I pressed the question. "Yeah, Nancy. She's an odd one. I'd just stay clear of her. I'm pretty sure she has dementia or something like that. Doesn't like to talk. Never has." David took another swig of his beer. I knew he was lying to me. I remembered watching a video about psychology and how somebody's body language tells more than their own words. David's eyes shifted downward as he spoke, breaking eye contact. There was something strange about Nancy. I knew it. David knew it. The following Friday, I watched Nancy pull out of her driveway. Her vintage station wagon sped past my house, leaving only red streaks of light as she whizzed by. I must have been possessed by the spirit of Sherlock Holmes because I made the stupid decision to investigate. I knew something was off about her. I just wanted some closure. I know it was stupid, but there was no way I could just lay this to rest. I needed answers, and by fucking God, I was going to get them. I ran to my closet and pulled out a set of my darkest clothes, grabbed a flashlight, and chugged a beer from the fridge to carry on the buzz brought over from David's place. I was anxious as hell, but it was late. If I was going to do this, I had to do it right then and there. I crept out my back door, which led to the surrounding woods. When I had reached the edge of her property, I noticed the barn door just a couple 100 feet ahead was left ajar. An orange glow of a lantern was seeping through the gap in the door. I found this very unsettling since I knew Nancy hadn't been home yet. Even if she did, why would she be out in the barn at midnight? As I had gotten closer, an ungodly scream came from the barn. It wasn't an ordinary scream. It barely even sounded human. It sounded like the recording of a man screaming, but being played in reverse, compiled with the sound which a horse would make. Something had pulled me closer to the barn. I don't know if it was my own drunken ignorance or my unsettling curiosity. Every sign screamed for me to go home, but I persisted. 10 feet away from the barn door, I could hear the rattling of chains and grunts of what sounded like a very hefty man. The light that emitted from the door flickered as a man passed back and forth repeatedly. My hands were having fissures. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears like a war drum. The thought crossed my mind that I should turn and leave, forgetting the whole ordeal, but my suspicions got the best of me. This is when things took a turn for the worst. I edged my way against the door, peering through the opening. A giant of a man stood with his back facing me. He could have been at least 7 feet tall and weighed well into the 300-pound range. In front of him was a table, and he seemed to be fiddling around with something ahead. The unfamiliar sound roared again, but this time more distressed. I did my best to get a better look, but the large silhouette of the man was blocking my view. A twig snapped beneath my foot. My heart suddenly stopped. I held my breath. I could imagine my face started to turn blue. I was paralyzed, hoping he hadn't heard me. That's when my nightmare became reality. The Goliath spun around. My petrification was dismissed by the instinct to flee. I sprinted as fast as I could back through the woods and into my open back door. I locked it shut behind me and checked all of the others, including the windows. That night, I didn't turn on a single light, nor did I sleep a wink. Fortunately enough, I had the following day off work. I didn't even manage to fall asleep until the sun started to rise. I was woken up to a commotion. Peering out of my bedroom window, I saw several police cars outside of David's home. A feeling of dread fell over me as I recalled the occurrences of the night before. I knew this was, without a doubt, related. After the crowd had cleared, I made the decision to give David a call. There was no reply. I didn't want to intrude on whatever he had been going through, and soon after I had found out on my own. The evening news was on my television as I was preparing dinner for myself in the kitchen.
Police are on the lookout for a 6-year-old girl, Emily Schwartz, who had gone missing from her home last night. There were no signs of a struggle, but there is suspicion of foul play. Emily was last seen that night after her father, David Schwartz, had put her to bed. She has long light brown hair and freckles. If anyone has any information leading to the finding of this little girl, please contact your local police department immediately.
The knife I was holding fell out of my hand and clattered against the floor as stomach bile began to rise up my throat. I swallowed hard and reached out to hold myself up against the counter. Nancy Sullivan. I instantly ran to my room and snatched up my cell phone, dialing 911. I told the operator and she forwarded me to the local police. I told them everything, and I was scolded for my trespassing but thanked for giving them a lead. They told me that they would send a squad car out right away. I had cold sweats. Every vein in my body was bursting with blood and my face was red hot. I had decided to finish making dinner in order to distract myself. Where the fuck did it go? I thought to myself. I searched every nook and cranny for the knife I was just using moments ago. That's when I heard a thump from the laundry room that was connected to my kitchen, leading out a side door to the garage. I stopped for a moment, listening for another noise, in hopes that it was just my anxious mind playing tricks on me. I was relieved. That's when I heard it again. I knew something was wrong. That's when I thought of the missing knife. I wasn't going to let that fucking monster of a man get me. Not today. Suddenly the door flew open and out came the man that I had seen the night before. He stood there menacingly wielding the knife I had left on the kitchen floor. The giant slowly moved towards me. A sinister grin had spread across his wart-covered face. His nostrils flared and he wheezed with each step towards me. I acted on instinct. I flipped the cutting board upwards toward the man. The scene distracted him just enough to allow me to bolt through the back door towards the woods. The sun had just set, and an orange haze glowed from behind the trees, creating an even more horrifying setting as I blindly ran through the woods in an attempt to shake my pursuer. Stopping to catch my breath, leaning down with my hands on my knees, I looked up. That's when I noticed exactly where I was. Just 100 feet ahead was that barn. Nancy Sullivan's barn. Something called out to me. It must have been instinct. Instead of fleeing to safety, I knew what I had to do. I had to find out what was inside that barn. I had to find out what that man was doing. Although I had no clue, something was telling me it was connected to little Emily. The thought of that poor girl ran through my mind. I pictured her curled up somewhere inside that barn. Frightened, alone. It was the only motive I had to go inside. What I saw was far worse than anything I could imagine. By this time, the sun had fully set. The only light I had was from the full moon that had taken its place. I made my way towards the giant red door. An unlocked padlock rested on the latch. After pulling the door open, I was greeted by pure darkness and a smell so foul I nearly vomited. I looked around for the lantern that had been used for lighting the previous night. It was hanging on the wall next to the door. I grabbed it and turned it on. A weak flame came to life inside the lantern, just barely making things visible. When I turned to look ahead, I nearly dropped dead right then and there. The torso of a full-grown steed, limbs dismembered, sat in a pool of its own blood. On the table beside it was the body of my next-door neighbor, George. George had been tied down and gagged. His arms were removed at the shoulder, replaced by the limbs of the horse. His legs as well. Crude stitches held them in place like some sort of sadistic science experiment. I fell onto the table, trying to keep myself from collapsing onto the blood-soaked barn floor. I stumbled around, trying to collect myself. That's when I heard it. Faint breathing came from the stable door beside me. I swung it open, hoping for it just to be a sleeping horse. I was only partly right. Inside the stable was a horse, but it was barely alive. A giant wound held shut by staples while it lay there on its back. I noticed that a few of them had burst open. Then a sound arose from its stomach. A whimper. I didn't know what came over me, but before I could even realize what was going on, I had already been prying at the staples sealing the horse shut. Organs spewed out of its wound as I pried harder and harder. I had no clue what I was going to find until it revealed itself. Her arms and legs were tied together. Bright green eyes stared directly at me as I pulled the gaping hole open wider. Her mouth was sealed with tape, and above it, the familiar freckles of little Emily. I ripped the girl out of the horse's now lifeless body. Not a single thought had passed through my mind. After retrieving the girl and setting her on the floor, I pulled the tape from her mouth and used a nearby surgical blade to cut her bindings. She looked terrified. I could tell she was weak. Probably sedatives. I grabbed Emily and carried her in my arms as I ran toward the open barn door. I passed through only to see the red and blue lights of a police car across the field ahead, in front of Nancy's home. The sounds of leaves and twigs crunching caused me to look to my left as I saw the silhouette of the large, vicious man standing in the line of trees beyond. I didn't think twice. Sprinting across the field towards salvation, I screamed and pleaded, not even taking a second to look behind me to see if he was coming for us. We were home free. 2 officers embraced us as I dropped to the ground nearly 50 feet away from them. I blacked out. I remember waking up to the sounds of medical machinery. Disoriented, I looked around the room. I was in the hospital. I was safe. A wave of panic crashed into me hard like a tidal wave as I thought of what had happened to Emily. But with a sudden relief, a nurse and a police officer walked into the room. The details were pretty blurry as she dosed me with morphine upon her entry. Later on, I was questioned and I told them about Nancy. I told them about the man. I told them about George. They understood and didn't see me as a suspect. I was a hero. They never found Nancy or the man. That's what terrifies me the most. But David got his little girl back, and she was unharmed aside from a few scrapes and bruises. The police forced me to sign a document saying that I would never speak to the media or anyone about this. It was an open investigation, and I was to keep my mouth shut until they came to a conclusion. But that never happened. I still talk to David now and again. He has been more than grateful for saving his daughter's life. Of course, I was happy to do so. He soon moved out of the house and out of state to be with his parents. I moved back to the city, where I belong. The funny thing is, I always thought it was safer in the suburbs. But little do you know, evil lurks everywhere.